carriage wheels had not yet stopped turning when the front doors of Ashbourne Hall opened from the inside, and the Duke of Ashbourne, stepping down into his own courtyard for the first time in 7 months, found that no one had come out to meet him. He had a few seconds to register this, the way a man registers a missing step in the dark. The footmen at the door stood at correct attention. The grooms moved with their usual silent competence around the horses. A lamp burned in the window of the green drawing room, exactly where it always burned at this hour, and the long windows of the dining room beyond glowed, amber against the deepening blue of an autumn evening. Everything was in its place. Only his wife was not on the steps, and no one had run ahead to fetch her. And the silence of his own household, perfectly polite and perfectly intact, felt suddenly like a closed door. He removed his gloves 1 finger at a time. He had rehearsed his entrance on the long road north, the warmth he would summon, the small, generous lie he would offer, the kiss he would press to her temple, as if 7 months were a trifle and a mistress, an invention of vicious tongues. The kiss had nowhere to land. A young footman he did not recognize bowed and murmured, "My lord," and stepped aside, and Ashbourne walked into his own house as though across a stage whose actors had agreed, in his absence, on a different play. From somewhere deep in the hall, beyond the marble staircase, beyond the closed library doors, came the low, untroubled sound of a man laughing. Not a servant's laugh, careful and quickly swallowed. A guest's laugh, slow and pleased, the laugh of a man who had been given the best chair and the best wine and the best attention, and who had no reason whatever to suppress his enjoyment of them. Ashbourne paused on the black and white tiles. He had not been announced. The butler, Forster, who had served his father and grandfather and had always met him at the door with a small, dry, ancestral nod, was nowhere to be seen. In Forster's place stood a housekeeper he had hired himself 3 years ago. Mrs. Lyle, and Mrs. Lyle was looking at him with the expression of a woman calculating which of 2 storms to step into. "Her Grace," she said, and stopped. Ashbourne waited. He had learned in the army and in Parliament and in certain rooms in town that a man who waits long enough is usually told the thing the speaker had not meant to say. "Her Grace, Mrs. Lyle," began again, "is at dinner, my lord." A guest had been received. The Duke had not been expected. The rooms had been aired this morning. Cook had been informed only an hour ago. There had been no time to send word to town. Ashbourne held up one hand, gently, and Mrs. Lyle stopped at once. He had not raised his voice in this house in 11 years of marriage, and he did not intend to start tonight in his own front hall. "Who is the guest?" he asked. Mrs. Lyle's eyes flicked just once toward the dining room door, and back. "His Grace the Duke of Hartwell," she said. There are degrees of silence, and Ashbourne had time, in the half-second after she spoke the name, to identify which degree this was. It was the silence in which a man hears the inside of his own ears. Hartwell, of course Hartwell. Hartwell, who had 3 royal great-grandmothers and a private fortune that no one had ever been impolite enough to measure, and a seat in council so old that the seat had been there before the council had been invented to contain it. Hartwell, whose carriages did not display arms because everyone already knew. Hartwell, who had been at school with Ashbourne and had treated him, then as now, with the faintly amused tolerance of a tall man for a man only slightly less tall. He could see, suddenly, with a clarity he did not at all wish to possess, the precise arrangement of the long table in the dining room beyond that door. The 2 of them at the corner, not at the ends. The candles lit, but not the chandelier. The chandelier was for crowds, and his wife had always preferred a smaller light. Hartwell on her right, where Ashbourne sat when Ashbourne was at home. The good wine, but not the best. the best she kept, with a discretion that had always touched him for occasions she expected him to be there to recognize. She had not poured the best tonight. He noted this, and was unable to decide, in the same noting, whether the omission was a small loyalty to him or a small punishment. "May I take your coat, my lord?" said Mrs. Lyle, very softly. He let her take it. He let her take his hat, and his riding crop, and the soft leather case of papers that he had carried with him from town for no reason except that he had not wished to be parted from them on the road. He stood in the hall of his own house in his travel-creased coat, smelling of horse and of the road, and he understood that he could do one of three things. He could turn around, walk back out to the courtyard, climb into the carriage, and have himself driven the 8 miles to the inn at Marley, and present himself again in the morning, washed and shaved and sane. He could go up the back stairs to his rooms, change, and come down a quarter of an hour later as if he had been in the house all along. Or he could walk into that dining room now, as he was, and let his wife and her guest find him standing in the doorway, in the clothes of 7 months on the road, and a great deal of road dust on his boots. He thought, with a small, unwelcome jolt, of the woman he had left in the White House outside Bath, of the way she had stood at the window with her hand pressed flat to the glass as the carriage pulled away, and he understood that the woman in the White House had nothing whatever to do with this hall, this evening, or this decision, and that he had been a fool to imagine, even for the length of a country mile, that she ever would. "Where," he asked Mrs. Lyle, "is Forster?" Mrs. Lyle inclined her head a quarter of an inch. "Forster," she said, "retired to his rooms at 6. Her Grace gave him leave." "Her Grace," said Ashbourne, "has been giving a great many people leave." Mrs. Lyle did not answer. He had not, after all, asked a question. He stood for a moment longer in the cool of the hall, listening, and from beyond the dining-room door he heard now the soft, low voice of his wife, saying something he could not catch, and then Hartwell again, quiet and amused, replying. There was no clinking of glasses, no raised laughter. The conversation had the texture of a thing that had been going on for some time, and would willingly go on for some time more. He walked past Mrs. Lyle, past the closed library doors, past the long mirror in which a tired, dust-coated man in a dark coat passed him without acknowledgement, and he stopped before the dining-room door. He did not knock. A man does not knock at his own dining room. He set his hand against the brass plate and felt, through the thin metal, the warmth of the room on the other side, and then he opened the door. The two of them looked up together, and neither was startled. That was the first thing he noticed, and it would prove to be, in the long unspooling of the evening and of everything that followed, the most important. His wife, Lady Eleanor Margaret Ashbourne, born Eleanor Margaret Sayre, of no particular family at all, sat at the corner of the long table, with her left hand resting lightly on the stem of a wine-glass, and her right hand laid flat on the linen beside her plate, in the attitude of a woman who has just finished saying a sentence and is waiting, with composure, for the response. Hartwell sat at her right, half turned toward her, one elbow on the table in a posture that in any other man Ashbourne would have called familiar, and in Hartwell merely looked considered. Their eyes moved to the door at the same instant, and in neither pair of eyes was there the small involuntary widening that betrays surprise. They had heard the carriage. They had heard the front door. They had, perhaps, heard Mrs. Lyle's voice in the hall, and Ashbourne's own, lowered as it had been. They had had, between them, the full minute he had spent standing in his own hallway deciding which kind of fool to be, and they had used that minute to compose their faces. Ashbourne, Eleanor said his name the way she said the names of guests at her own table, with a small, civil warmth at the front and a perfectly maintained neutrality behind it. "You are home." He inclined his head. "I am," he said. Hartwell rose. He did this without haste, as Hartwell did everything, and he came around the corner of the table with one hand extended, and he said, "My dear Ashbourne, you have caught us at our soup." The soup was long since cleared. There was, on Eleanor's plate, a small remnant of pheasant and a careful arrangement of pears poached in something dark. There was on Hartwell's plate the same. The decanter between them was 3/4 empty. The candles had burned down by the breadth of a thumb. Ashbourne took the offered hand and felt, in the dry, easy grip of it, the small, infuriating warmth of a man who is not at all sorry to be found where he is. "Hartwell," he said, "you are far from your own table." Hartwell smiled. "Ah," he said, "as to that, I was passing." He did not say what he had been passing toward or from, and Eleanor did not supply the information. She lifted the small bell at her elbow and rang it once, lightly, and a footman appeared at the inner door before the note had quite died, and she said, "A place for his lordship, please, and the wine he prefers, and the warm bread if there is any left from cook." The footman bowed and vanished. She had not asked Ashbourne whether he intended to sit. She had not asked whether he was hungry. She had assumed his presence and ordered for him as she had ordered for him every night of their married life when he was at home, and she had done it in front of Hartwell with the same untroubled smoothness with which she had, a moment before, been listening to whatever it was Hartwell had been saying. He found, as he crossed the room to take the chair at her left, that he was grateful to her for this, and that the gratitude irritated him, and that he could not at present afford to examine why. He sat. The footman returned with bread and a clean glass and a different wine, and Ashbourne let himself be served. Eleanor turned her face toward him for the first time at close range, and he saw what he had not been able to see from the door. She was thinner. Not very. Not in a way another man would notice. The hollow under her cheekbone was 1/4 of a shade deeper than he remembered it. The skin beneath her eyes was tighter. The earrings she wore were not the ones he had given her for their 7th anniversary, which had been her habitual evening earrings for 4 years, but smaller, plainer pearls, the kind a woman wears when she does not wish to be looked at too long. She was looking at him steadily and without reproach, and he understood, with the cold, exact understanding that comes once or twice in a life and never afterward leaves, that whatever account was being kept between them, she had been keeping it alone for 7 months, and the totals were not in his favor. "I trust," she said, "your journey was not too tiring." "It was tolerable," he said. "The roads are dry." "Good," she said. "And then, to Hartwell, you were saying." Hartwell allowed a small pause, the pause of a man who is deciding in real time how much of a conversation he is willing to continue in the company of a third party who has just walked in from the road, and then he resumed, as smoothly as if Ashbourne had been sitting there from the soup course. "I was saying," he said, "that the bill, as it stands, will not pass before Michaelmas. The opposition is too well organized. They have the bishops, which I had not expected, and they have your Lord Marbury, which I had." Ashbourne, who had heard nothing of any bill before this moment, lifted his glass and drank, slowly, and listened. Eleanor said, "The bishops will turn if the wording on the entail is softened. They have no objection to the principle, only to the precedent." Hartwell looked at her, and Ashbourne saw, in the brief exchange of their eyes, something he had not been prepared to see at his own table. Hartwell was listening to her. Not in the way men listen to clever wives at dinners, with the indulgent attention they would give a child reciting verse. He was listening to her as he would have listened to a colleague whose grasp of a problem had already proved, on previous occasions, to exceed his own. He was waiting for her to finish, and when she finished he said, "You may be right." And then he said, "In fact, you almost certainly are," and Ashbourne understood in that second small admission that whatever this dinner was, it was not the first of its kind. He set his glass down very carefully so that it would not strike the wood. "How long," he said, mildly, "has my wife been advising the Duke of Hartwell on legislation?" Eleanor did not look at him. She broke a small piece from her bread and laid it on her plate and said, "Since March, my lord." "Since March?" he repeated. "Since March," she said. There was a silence then of the kind he had once thought himself master of. It was Hartwell who broke it, and he broke it kindly, as a man of perfect manners breaks any silence into which he has been, however indirectly, the cause of leading another man. "Your lady," he said, "was good enough to answer a letter I wrote in the spring, on a matter of some delicacy concerning the northern boroughs. Her answer was so clear and so to the point that I wrote again, and then I came. I have come, in fact, rather often. I have always sent word ahead. I have always sent word, too, to your steward, who has, I believe, kept your books informed of my visits in the proper way. I would not have you imagine, Ashbourne, that anything has occurred here in your absence which would not bear, in every particular, the brightest possible light." Ashbourne looked at him. Hartwell looked back, evenly, with the steady gaze of a man who is telling the exact truth and is perfectly aware that the exact truth is, in this room, the second most painful thing he could be saying. The most painful thing, of course, was the thing he had not said and would not say, because Hartwell did not say such things. He merely allowed them to be understood. The most painful thing was that Hartwell had come again and again to a house in which the master was absent, to consult a woman whose mind he had discovered, by accident, to be the equal of his own, and that in 7 months of consulting her he had come to enjoy the consulting, and that he had been welcomed in the long evenings of an empty country house by a woman who had nowhere else to put the part of herself her husband had stopped asking to see. Ashbourne lifted his glass again. "Brightest possible light," he said. "Quite so. I thank you for the courtesy." The pears went away. The cloth was lifted. The candles were trimmed by a footman who did this with the careful neutrality of a man trained never to seem to hear what is said over his head, and a second decanter was set down. Eleanor rose. "I will leave you," she said. "You will wish to speak." She said it as women say it in great houses every evening of the year, after every dinner, with no implication beyond the customary. Hartwell rose too, and bowed over her hand as if she were the hostess of a state occasion, and not the wife of his schoolfellow in a country dining-room in October. She turned at the door and looked back, not at Ashbourne, but at the table between them, as a woman might look at a board on which a difficult game had been left in mid-play, and then she went out. The door closed. The two dukes were alone. Hartwell sat down. He did not at once speak. He turned the stem of his glass between his thumb and forefinger and watched the small spiral of the wine. "Ashbourne," he said at last, "I owe you no apology, and I will offer you none, because if I offered you one we should both feel worse, and the situation, which is delicate, would become impossible. But I will say this. I have known your wife 11 years, as you have. For 10 of those years I knew her as your wife, which is to say I did not know her at all. This past year I have come to know her as herself, and I tell you frankly, as one friend to another, that you have at your table a woman whose understanding of the management of an estate, the temper of a county, and the working of a bill through committee exceeds that of any 3 of the men sitting on our benches at present. She has not told me where you have been. She has not told me how long you intend to be there. She has not, in any conversation I have had with her under this roof, spoken your name except as the master of the house, the way a steward might. I have come to understand certain things, as men of our age must, by what is not said. I do not judge you. I have no standing to, but I will say one further thing, and then we will speak of other matters. If you have come home for an evening before you go again, I will leave the house tomorrow morning, and I will not return. If you have come home to stay, I will leave the house tomorrow morning, and I will not return. The only circumstance in which I will return to this house, Ashbourne, is the one in which your wife sends for me, and you may take what comfort you can from my telling you, with the directness due to an old friend, that in 7 months under this roof she has never once sent for me. I have always come uninvited, and she has always, with perfect courtesy, given me an hour of her time, and then sent me on my way to the inn at Marley, where I have slept every night, in a room not large enough for a tall man to dress in. He drank. He set down the glass. He looked, for the first time, openly tired. "Now," he said, "tell me about your bill." Ashbourne did not at once answer. He had been prepared, in the long carriage hours and the longer hours before, for a great many things. He had been prepared for a wife in tears. He had been prepared for a wife in fury. He had been prepared, in the small, dishonorable corner of his mind where men prepare for the worst, for a wife in another man's arms, and he had rehearsed, with the cold practicality of a man who has lived a long time in the world, the things he would and would not do in that case. He had not been prepared for a wife who had spent his absence not weeping, not raging, not betraying him, but quietly and seriously becoming the person she had perhaps always been and had been prevented, by the ordinary kindness of his attention, from becoming. He had not been prepared to be told, in his own dining room, by a man whose word in such matters was as good as any oath, that nothing dishonorable had happened, and to feel, as he was told it, the curious and unwelcome ache of a man who has been spared a wound he had almost begun to count on, because a real wound would have given him something simple to do, and what he had been given instead was complicated. He looked at Hartwell. He thought, with a small, almost amused clarity, that Hartwell was the only man of his acquaintance who would have walked into this evening as he had, and the only man who would have walked through it as he had, and that there was a reason, after all, that the Sayre girl, with no family and no fortune, and only her composure and her wit to recommend her, had attracted the attention of the first Duke in the kingdom in a season in which she had also attracted the attention of the second. He had married her. Hartwell, who had been 32 and not yet ready, had let her go. He had not, evidently forgotten. "There is no bill," said Ashbourne. Hartwell raised one eyebrow. "I beg your pardon," he said. "There is no bill." Ashbourne said again, "I have been 7 months in the country outside Bath, in a house I do not own, with a woman who does not love me, and whom I do not love. And we have both known it from the second week, and we have neither of us known how to bring it to an end without unkindness. I have not been in Parliament. I have not been in town. I have not, in fact, been anywhere that a duke of this kingdom ought to have been. I have been hiding, Hartwell. I have been hiding from a wife I no longer knew how to speak to. And I have been hiding in a place where I was, for a time, addressed by a name I had not had to live up to in a very long while." he stopped. He was astonished to have said it. He had said it to no one, not even to himself in those exact words, and he had said it now to Hartwell, of all men, across his own table, with the candles burning down between them and the door closed and his wife somewhere above their heads in the long quiet of her own rooms, doing whatever a woman of her composure did at the end of an evening of this kind. Hartwell did not move. He did not look surprised, and he did not look pleased, and he did not look mercifully sympathetic. He looked only attentive, in the way he had looked at Eleanor over the pears, as a man looks at a problem whose shape he is at last beginning to see. "Then," he said, "you have a great deal of work to do." "Yes," said Ashbourne, "I have." He drank. The wine was very good. He noted, with the part of his mind that still noted such things, that it was the best wine from his own cellar, the one she had kept, all these years, for occasions she expected him to be there to recognize, and that she had ordered it, after all, for him, not at the start of the evening, when she had not known he was coming, but at the moment of his sitting down, when she had decided. In the small interval between his entering the room and his taking the chair at her left, that she would not punish him in front of a guest. He set the glass down. He did not trust his hand on the stem of it. They sat for a while longer in silence, and then they spoke of the bill that did exist, and of the bishops, and of Lord Marbury, who was, it appeared, even worse than Ashbourne remembered. And at last Hartwell rose. "I will go to the inn," he said. "I will leave in the morning. You will not see me again in this house unless your wife sends for me, and as I have said, she will not. Good night, Ashbourne." He paused at the door. "And," he said, without turning, "you are a fortunate man. You ought to know it." He went out. Ashbourne did not go up at once. He sat at the long table for a quarter of an hour after Hartwell's carriage had been heard in the courtyard, and after the courtyard had been heard to settle again, and he watched the candles burn. And he listened, through the closed door, to the small, ordinary sounds of a house putting itself to bed. The clink of plate in the scullery, the soft tread of a maid on the back stair, the cough, somewhere far above, of an old hound he had bought the year of his marriage, who was now, he calculated, 12, and who had, in the courtyard earlier, declined to come down the steps to meet him, and whom he had not blamed for it. He thought of the woman in the White House outside Bath. He thought of her without anger, and without longing, and without the small, false tenderness he had used, in the carriage and on the road, and over a great many breakfasts in the last 2 months, to disguise from himself the fact that he had stopped feeling much of anything for her at all. She was a kind woman. She was a clever woman in her way, which was not Eleanor's way. She had taken him in when he had been ridiculous, and had given him a room and a fire and a place to be a man without consequence for a season, and she had known, from the second week as he had said, that he would go. And she had let him go without a scene, because she was, in fact, kinder than he was. He owed her, he saw now, an honest letter, and a settled income, and the use of the house for as long as she wished it, and no more of his attention, ever, of any kind. He would write the letter tomorrow. He would write it before breakfast. He would write it in his own hand, because some debts cannot be paid by a secretary. He rose. He took up one of the candles, because the corridors at this hour were lit only at the turnings, and he did not wish to send for a servant, and he went out into the hall. The house was very quiet. The mirror at the foot of the staircase showed him, again, the tired, dust-coated stranger in the dark coat, and this time he met the stranger's eyes for a moment, and they did not flinch from one another. He went up. He passed his own rooms without stopping. He walked the long carpeted corridor to the east wing, to the door of her sitting room, which stood, as it had always stood at this hour, an inch ajar. Because she liked, on autumn evenings, to feel the air of the house move through her windows. He set his hand on the door. He did not push it. He stood for a moment in the corridor, with the candle in his other hand, and he understood that he had not, in fact, the smallest right to push this door tonight, and that whatever he was about to do was the first act of a long, slow, unglamorous work, and that he had better begin it as he meant to continue it, with patience. He knocked. He had not knocked at his wife's door in 11 years. The knock sounded, in the long corridor, like a small bell struck once, and then there was silence, and then her voice, perfectly composed, said, "Come in." He went in. She was at her writing desk by the window. She had put on a shawl. She had taken down her hair, and it was pinned up again loosely, the way she pinned it for sleeping. And she had a pen in her hand and a half-written page beneath it, and she did not put the pen down. She did, however, turn in her chair, and she looked at him gravely, without surprise. He set the candle on the table by the door. He did not move toward her. "May I sit?" he said. "The chair," she said, "is yours." He sat. He looked at the rug, which had been a wedding gift from an aunt of hers who had not believed, at the time, that the marriage would last 6 months. The rug had lasted 11 years and showed almost no wear. He thought, irrelevantly, that the aunt had been a good judge of carpets and a poor judge of women. "Eleanor," he said. She waited. "I have not," he said, the words for this. She nodded once, gravely. Then, she said, "Do not look for them yet. Sit." He sat. The clock on her mantel ticked. A log shifted in her grate, very softly, with the small sigh of wood that has been burning a long time and is at last giving up the last of its shape. Outside, the wind moved through the limes on the south lawn, and somewhere far off, beyond the park, a dog answered another dog and was answered back. He had heard these sounds every autumn of his married life and had not, until tonight, heard them. "Hartwell," he said at last, "has told me." She inclined her head. "He has told me," he said, "that nothing has happened." "I know," she said. "And," he said, "I know it too, without his telling me. I have known it from the moment I came into the room. I want you to know that I have known it." She set the pen down. It was the first thing she had done with her hands since he came in, and he watched the small, careful gesture as if it were a thing of importance, which, he understood, it was. "Thank you," she said. He took a breath. "Eleanor," he said, "I have been a fool." She did not contradict him. She did not agree. She watched him with the steady, unjudging gaze with which she had once watched him 11 years ago, across a different table, in the first week of their acquaintance, when she had been a girl of no family at all, and he had been a young duke too pleased with himself to know yet what he had been given. "I have been," he said, "in Somerset." "I know," she said. "I have been with a woman who is not my wife." "I know that too," she said. "I have not," he said, "loved her." "I know that as well," she said. He looked at her. "How?" he said. She smiled, faintly, because, she said, "If you had loved her, you would not have come home tonight, and certainly not in those boots." He looked down at his boots. They were appalling. He laughed, once, a short, startled sound that surprised him very much, and she laughed too, very quietly, and for a moment the room was the room of two people who had laughed together for a long time and had not forgotten how. The moment passed. She folded her hands in her lap. "I will not ask you," she said, "what you intend to do. You will tell me when you have decided. I will ask you only one thing tonight, and you may answer it now or in the morning, as you please." He waited. "Did you come home," she said, "because you were tired of her, or because you remembered me?" He did not at once answer. He had, in the carriage, prepared a great many answers for a great many questions, and he had not prepared this one, because he had not believed she would ask it, and he had not believed, if she did, that he would have the courage to answer it truthfully. He thought of the White House, and the woman at the window, and the road north, and the inn at Marley, and the candles in the dining room downstairs, and the second best wine and the best wine, and Hartwell's eyes across the pears. "I came home," he said, "because I remembered you. I had been told, on the road, by a man I trust, that the Duke of Hartwell had been seen at Ashbourne Hall this summer. I rode the last 40 miles in a temper I am not proud of. I came up the drive intending to be the kind of husband who walks into his own dining room in his riding boots and makes a scene. I did walk into the dining room in my riding boots. I did not make the scene. I did not make it because the moment I saw you at that table I understood, before I had any business understanding it, that whatever was happening in that room was not happening to me, it was happening to you, and that you had earned it, every part of it, in the 7 months I had been away, and in the 10 years before, that in which I had not, as Hartwell put it, known you. I came home, Eleanor, because I had been jealous of a man I had no right to be jealous of, and I have stayed in this room tonight because I have understood, in the last hour, that the man I have most to be jealous of is the one I have been, and that I would like, if you will allow it, to begin to be a different one." She did not speak for a long time. The clock ticked. The log in the grate gave another small sigh. She looked at her hands in her lap, and then she looked at him, and her eyes were bright but not wet, because she was not, and had never been, a woman who wept easily, and she said very quietly, "That is a great deal to say in one breath, my lord." He bowed his head. "I have had," he said, "a great deal of road in which to compose it." She almost smiled. "Go to bed," she said. "Not here. In your own rooms. Wash, sleep. In the morning we will speak again, and you will tell me what you mean to do about the house outside Bath, and I will tell you what I mean to do about the bill on which I have been advising the Duke of Hartwell, which is, by the way, a very good bill, and which I should like to see passed before my Kelmis, with or without your help, though I should prefer it with." He rose. He stood for a moment by her chair. He did not touch her. He had not, he realized, the smallest right to touch her, and would not have, perhaps for a long while, and the realization, which ought to have been bitter, was instead, oddly, a relief, for it gave him at last a thing to do, and a length of time in which to do it, and a clear and specific shape for the work of the rest of his life. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes," she said. "Thank you," he said for the wine. She looked up at him, and this time she did smile, the small, dry, perfectly composed smile he had not seen on her face in 7 months, and possibly, he thought, much longer than that. "You are welcome," she said. "It is, after all, your cellar." He took up his candle. He went out. He closed the door softly behind him, and he stood for a moment in the corridor, listening, and from within the room he heard, after a little while, the soft scrape of her chair as she turned back to her desk, and the small, dry scratch of her pen as she resumed the letter he had interrupted, and he understood, listening, that she had not been writing to Hartwell. She had been writing to her steward in the north about the entail. He went down the corridor to his own rooms. He undressed in the dark. He lay a long while awake, watching the moon move across the ceiling, and he thought, without any drama at all, that he had a great deal of work to do, and that he had, perhaps, just enough life left to do it in, and that this was, in its quiet way, the best news he had received in a very long time. He woke before the house. He had always woken before the house, in the years when he had been the kind of man who deserved to, and he was pleased, in a small, careful way, to discover that the habit had not left him. He dressed without ringing for his man. He shaved himself, badly, at the cold basin, because he did not, this morning, wish to be tended to. He went down the back stairs in the gray light and let himself out through the kitchen passage, and he stood for a moment in the kitchen garden, in the cold and the wet grass, and he watched his breath go up into the pale air, and he listened to the rooks waking in the elms beyond the wall. He thought of a great many things, briefly, and then he thought of one thing, slowly. And that was the letter to the woman in the White House outside Bath, and the precise words he would use, and the income he would settle, and the small, true kindness with which he would close it, because she had been kind to him, and he owed her, at the very least, kindness in return. He went back inside. He went to the library. He set out paper, and he sharpened a pen, and he sat down, and he began to write. He had not finished the letter when he heard, in the corridor, the sound of his wife's step, and then, behind her, the soft tread of Forster, who had evidently been informed of his master's return by a household that ran on its own intelligence and required no announcements from anyone, and who came into the library with the small, dry, ancestral nod of a man who has served 3 generations of one family and does not intend, at his age, to be impressed by the 4th. "Good morning, my lord," said Forster. "Good morning, Forster," said Ashbourne. "Welcome home, my lord," said Forster, and there was, in the small inflection on the word home, the only reproach Ashbourne would receive, in that house, from anyone, ever, on the subject of his absence, and it was, he understood, a fair one. "Thank you," he said. Forster bowed and withdrew. Eleanor came in. She had dressed for the morning in gray, and she had put up her hair properly, and she was carrying a small folded paper which was, he saw, a list. She set it on the desk in front of him without preamble. "These," she said, "are the matters on which decisions have been deferred against your return. I have done what I could. There are some I could not do without you. We will go through them after breakfast." He looked at the list. It was long. It was meticulous. It was in her hand. He looked up at her. He said, "Eleanor." She waited. He said, "I am very glad to be home." She looked at him for a moment, and then she did a thing she had not done in 7 months, and had not perhaps done in a great while before that. She laid her hand, lightly, briefly, on his shoulder. She did not say anything. She took her hand away, and she went to the window, and she stood for a moment looking out at the park, where the mist was lifting from the lower lawn and the sun. The small, late autumn sun was beginning to come up over the line of the elms. "I am glad," she said without turning, "that you are home." The light came up. The day began. The work, the long, slow, unglamorous work of becoming the man he had only that night decided to be, began with it, and it would go on, in that house and in that marriage and in that county, for many years, and would not always be easy, and would be, in the end, the only thing he had done with his life that was worth the telling. And as for the others, the woman in the White House outside Bath received her letter and her income, and married, 2 years later, a kind country attorney who adored her, and lived a long, quiet life and did not, in that long life, think of the Duke of Ashbourne more than once or twice a year, and then only with a small, dry smile. Lord Marbury opposed the bill, and the bill passed anyway, by a margin of 7 votes, the 7 votes being, as everyone afterward agreed, the personal work of the Duchess of Ashbourne, who had written, in her own hand, to each of the 7 members in question, and had been, in each case, Persuasive, the Duke of Hartwell did not, as he had said he would not, return to Ashbourne Hall uninvited. He was, however, invited, 3 years later, to stand as godfather to the Ashbournes' second child, a daughter, and accepted with grave pleasure, and was, by all accounts, an exemplary godfather, and sent, every birthday of her life, a small, thoughtful gift, and never, in any letter or in any conversation, alluded to the autumn of the pears. Forster lived another 9 years, and died in his own bed, in the small room he had occupied for 41 years, and was buried, by his own request, in the churchyard within sight of the kitchen garden. The old hound, who had refused to come down the steps, came down them a week later of his own accord, and laid his head on his master's boot, and was forgiven, and forgave, and lived another 2 winters, and was, when he went, much missed. And now you and I, you who have listened so patiently in the warm half-dark while the fire has burned down between us, sit a little while longer in the quiet the story has left behind. If you have ever come home, late, to a house you had half forgotten how to live in, and found that the people you loved had, in your absence, become more themselves than you had given them leave to be, and felt, standing in your own hall, the small and necessary humiliation of being loved by someone who had not waited for you, exactly, but had not gone, either, then you know already what the Duke of Ashbourne learned that October night, and you know that the learning of it is not the end of a story, but the beginning of a better one. Tell me, before you go, which moment did you carry with you? Was it the candles burning down between the 2 dukes, or the second-best wine that became the best, or the small dry smile in the doorway of the writing room, or the hand laid briefly on a shoulder in the morning light? Sit by this fire again, when you can. There is always another story banked in the embers, another door about to open on another hall, another quiet, ordinary, almost unbearable moment in which someone is, at last, truly seen. Keep your seat warm. I will keep the fire. Good night, dear listener. Sleep gently.